Okay. And I would like to pass the floor to Maureen Delbeck.
Hi, as Erin said, my name is Maureen Dahlbeck. I'm also a member of the Responsibility.org team, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Educational Programs. The mission of Responsibility.org is threefold. We work to eliminate underage drinking, to eliminate drunk driving, and work with others to eliminate all forms of impaired driving. And we also work to empower adults of legal drinking age who choose who, if they choose to drink, do so responsibly. Since 1991, we have made great progress on all three of our missions. We have not done it alone because we all have a seat at the table of responsibility, and responsibility starts with each one of us. Responsibility.org is all about conversations that lead to a lifetime of healthy alcohol choices. But not every conversation is about alcohol, and not everyone makes responsible choices if or when they choose to drink. That is what our session is about today. Allow me to set the stage by sharing some of the stats regarding drunk driving in our country. Many of you may already be aware of these numbers, but I'll repeat them anyway and remind all of us that these are just not numbers, they are people, family members, friends, colleagues, and more. According to the latest data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, nearly 41,000 people died in traffic crashes in 2023, including more than 12,000 people, or about 30%, who died in a drunk driving crash. And while drunk driving fatalities decreased more than 7% from 2022 to 2023, 12 states and the District of Columbia reported an increase in the number of alcohol-impaired driving fatalities during this period. Since 1982, drunk driving fatalities on our nation's roadways have decreased 41%, while total traffic fatalities have declined 7%. Among persons under the age of 21, drunk driving fatalities have decreased 73% during this time. In a recent survey of American adults conducted by Responsibility.org, 90% reported they have not driven a motor vehicle while impaired in the past year. However, 10% report that they have driven under the influence. Early estimates for 2024 traffic fatalities indicate the decline that started in the mid-2022 is continuing, and we expect to hear soon from NHTSA's latest data that the first quarter of 2025 will also show a decline. Despite this progress, we know there is still more work to do, and our commitment to eliminating drunk driving and other forms of impaired driving is stronger than ever. This led us to conduct this research, and today our speaker, Dan Drath, will share some findings from this research that we commissioned to understand the why behind people's choices to drink and drive. We have worked with Dan for more than a decade on a variety of research projects. Before we get too far into it, I'd like for Dan to introduce himself and his work. We have also one of our colleagues, Darren Grundell from Responsibility.org, who's the Senior Vice President of Traffic Safety and the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving, standing by to answer questions. He is the lead of traffic safety and a true wealth of knowledge. Dan?
Good morning from the West Coast. Good afternoon to many of you. My firm is called Colloquial Insights. We are a market research firm that focuses on interviewing qualitative research among a broad swath of consumers. Oftentimes it's teenagers up through baby boomers. We, in the before COVID times, spent most of our time speaking with folks in person. Now a lot of it is on Zoom, but I'm happy to say that today's research is based upon some in-person focus groups that we did in Sacramento in Fresno, California, as well as a couple of other markets. I'm excited to begin to walk us through this. Maureen, shall I take over the screen share and dig in?
Yes, please.
All right. So, pardon me one moment as I just make sure I do this right. All right. Erin, Maureen, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So let's begin to sort of walk through this research. So this was a series of focus groups that we conducted to speak to consumers across the country. We wanted to understand the catalysts that do prompt some adults to drive in an impaired state. We wanted to understand the signs that adults recognize of their own impairment when they're drinking away from home. And we wanted to understand how they assess their own physical and mental impairment when drinking to help understand what leads some of them to then drive in an impaired state. This was the result of 9 focus groups. We divided them by age. We spoke to 20 somethings, 30 somethings, and then 40 to 54-year-olds. This was work that we specifically did in a range of markets to capture different residential dynamics and transportation dynamics. We were in urban downtown Chicago, speaking to people who do live within the city limits and are they own cars, but are perhaps driving less than the folks in suburban Denver, who all lived in the outer kind of exurban areas and were heavily car dependent. We also wanted to go to a more rural market, which took us to Fresno, California. This was a mix of men and women from a range of different ethnicities. All of them had completed high school and were minimally employed part-time. We spoke to a range of different professions. We spoke to college students, grad students, mail carriers, accountants. I went back this morning to look through all my notes. This work was done late last year. Retail store managers, even some teachers, school administrators, nurses, janitors, private security. We had a really great representation of different walks of life. Something they all had in common, though, is that they were drinking at least 3 servings of alcoholic beverages a week, many drinking much more than that. We wanted to make sure that they are drinking alcohol away from home. I'll talk about some of those locations in a moment. All of them had a valid driver's license and are driving their cars or motorcycles at least 4 times a week. All of them needed to have reported having driven a motor vehicle after some amount of alcohol at least 3 times in the past year. Most reported having done even more than that. And we also wanted to include some who had consumed both alcohol and marijuana or another drug as well to understand some of the dynamics related to that. So that was the set of qualifications that to ground you all in who you're going to be hearing about today. And let's dig in then. So we began our focus groups with them, trying to understand where are they drinking away from home that might lead them to impaired while driving behaviors on their way home. We heard about many of the expected places: bars, restaurants, clubs, lounges, social clubs, comedy clubs, wineries, breweries, a lot of that in Denver, casinos. We heard a lot about drinking on public transportation. Interestingly enough, they're not maybe drinking on their way out versus on their way home, which is when the impaired driving is occurring. From the young people, we heard about drinking in parking lots and during car meetups, a lot of pre-gaming. These different locations, though, were consistent across our locations: urban, suburban, and rural. Further, we did hear about sort of as they get to these locations, it's cars, it's ride shares, it's public transportation, but many of them find themselves in private vehicles on their way home with friends, with others, or perhaps, of course, their own cars. And we also heard a lot about pre-gaming at home. It's a great way for them, they say, to save money on their first drinks and amp up their own sociability. So this is where a lot of the drinking preceding the impaired driving is occurring. We did hear that recreational drug use is increasingly common, but there does seem to be caution around mixing substances and alcohol, especially the 20s and 30s, but other age groups as well. Talked a lot about recreational drug use, of course, marijuana most of all. We also heard, though, about ketamine, mushrooms, cocaine. These are and it's always remarkable to me what people are willing to tell you in a focus group, but they were quite forthcoming. There's a sense of almost community when they're together having these conversations, and people begin to be quite forthcoming, sharing their experiences. They did note caution around mixed consumption of recreational drugs and alcohol before driving. There's recognition that it can very strongly impact impairment and makes for, as they said, a less fun evening. So there is recreational drug use happening, thankfully, not as much mixing before driving, but we will get to the driving behaviors momentarily. Most described informally thinking ahead to the drinking that they're likely to do at the start of an evening. There they are at home, they're getting ready to go out, and to some degree, they're making a plan. They're purposely thinking ahead about the evening, especially those who have a past DUI or DWAI. They're thinking about their evening and safe drinking. They go in with good intentions. They're thinking to themselves, how big of a day or a night am I going to be having? Where am I headed? Who am I going to be with? And how heavily does that group drink? How much have they eaten or how much water have they had that day? What do they think they're planning to drink? How much do they want to spend that night? What do they have to do the next day? What other substances could they be consuming? And is there going to be a designated driver? So people are entering in with good intentions. These things are on their minds as they quote unquote make a plan. That plan then informs how much do they plan to drink overall? When throughout the evening are they going to be drinking? What are their modes of transportation going to be? Are they taking their own car? Are they planning to leave it and get home a different way? It's when they deviate from this plan and consume more than they intend when impaired driving occurs, despite their best intentions. Throughout the course of an evening of drinking, they're self-assessing their degree of impairment and asking themselves, how am I acting? What can I do? And how do I feel? So what we heard them tell us was, am I acting goofy? Am I giggling? Am I slurring my words? Am I speaking loudly? Am I forgetting my train of thought? Am I hugging people more? Am I stumbling? How's my balance? Can I walk in a straight line? We heard people tell us that they think about reciting the alphabet backwards. Are they able to send a text? And then does the room feel like it's spinning? Are they hot, sweaty, clammy mouthed? These are all the things that are on their minds as they begin to think about, am I impaired as the night goes on? And how am I going to get home? And what decisions do I need to make? Some, and mostly those on the older end of the spectrum, older, of course, here being 30s, 40s, 50s versus 20s, claim to sort of do some math to gauge their impairment. They're thinking about the number of drinks they've had. Many of the more mature kind of feel like they know their limit today. They know that it's less than it was when they were younger. They think about maybe kind of, well, how many drinks have I had in total? How am I starting impaired? Am I starting to feel? This might lead them to front load their drinking earlier in the evening or to pace themselves out over the course of the drinking occasion. Notably, this self-gauged number is more than 2 per hour. It seems like it's more like 3 or 4. So that's leading some to make some poor decisions around driving because their own self-assessment of how much they think they can drink is more than what our data suggests is truly advised. Most of the folks we spoke to said they've heard of ABV, but it's not generally factoring into their drinking decisions. They've heard the term, it's something that's familiar to them from beer bottles and menus. However, it's generally not impacting their decisions around sort of impaired driving and how much to drink. Instead of ABV, they're mostly thinking about the total number of drinks they've had in the evening, the type of alcohol they're having. Is it beer? Is it wine? Is it liquor? How potent is it? And how heavy are the pours that they're being served? We did, in fact, hear a few say they purposely choose higher ABV to maximize their bang for buck, how much they're spending on alcohol. And some did suggest it could slow their drinking if it's high ABV, but those were definitely the exceptions, not the rule. And so in our conversations at that point, we felt like we had a pretty good understanding of where they're drinking, how they're assessing their impairment, what intentions they had going into the evening. However, there is a strong perception that driving after drinking is really common. And that opened up the conversation to hear from them about their own individual experiences and decisions. There is a widespread belief, and this was across Fresno, Denver, Chicago, that it's pretty common, publicly widespread to be drinking after driving. Excuse me, driving after drinking. Most say, well, most of my friends don't do it. It's other people. And they're basing that based upon how many cars they see at the bars they go to or at the sporting events and how much drinking they see happening at those events. If there are that many cars there and there are people drinking that much, many people have got to be drinking and then driving. And many do know friends or others in their network who have recently had a DUI or a DWI. So they're aware that like this behavior is happening. There is a sense it's quite widespread, but maybe not necessarily in their close in networks. Except when we would begin to probe them and say, well, is this something you've ever done? Or is this something you have any experience with? Most would begin to admit, yeah, I think I have done that. It seems to happen in a gray area. I'm not obviously or overtly drunk. At the time, I didn't think so. But later, once I'm home or after the fact, in retrospect, they begin to think, yeah, I probably should not have driven after all. This is something that they think when they get home or that they happen to think the next morning, perhaps when they're hungover. And that's when they really realize or take stock of, I truly was more impaired than I realized, and I probably shouldn't have driven myself home. Most said they generally know their limit, but they still occasionally take this risk. So it may be not every drinking occasion, but it's enough throughout the course of the year to contribute quite impactfully to the statistics that Maureen raised earlier. Notably, servers are generally not seen as discouraging overconsumption. They're not encouraging it, but they're also not seen as discouraging it. The servers are generally said to be, keeping serving even very drunk patrons. These drinkers we spoke to said, well, clearly the servers are doing this to increase their tips. And the servers probably assume that these drinkers have arranged a ride home. It's believed that servers only cut off drinkers when it's already too late. The drinkers are heavily impaired, and it is likely at a point that they're creating a disturbance. These folks we spoke to didn't seem to be blaming the servers, but they also didn't say the servers were doing much to stop it. So then we started really trying to understand, why is it that you find yourself driving drunk when you didn't have that intention and probably definitely know better? So let's walk through a range of those catalysts that we heard. Many simply don't believe they're actually too drunk to drive. What they told us is, I don't believe I'm that drunk. If I can walk straight, I can drive straight. I don't think about the fact that I'm going to be going 30 to 40 miles an hour, one person told us in Denver. Many have a misbelief that they'll sober up when they're driving, or that soberness kicks in behind the wheel. We heard somebody in Fresno tell us, I drink until I'm ready to go home. When I get in my driver's seat, I feel like I sober up. But then when I get home, I'm drunk again. I don't know how that works. I mean, it was kind of comical to hear these things and need to maintain a straight face during the research, but this is what people are telling us. And there's also a belief that DUIs and crashes simply won't happen to me. There is a sense that this is not something that's going to believably or credibly have an individual impact on them. It really is sort of fueled in some sense by a sense of invincibility. We heard them say that, like, I think I'm invincible. I always got away with this before. I don't think this time is as bad as past times, and I don't want to be told what to do. So all of these are things they tell us are reasons why they may find themselves driving while impaired. Many also drive home impaired because it just seems like a short distance. And interestingly enough, this was true even in places like Denver, where we specifically recruited and identified people because of the greater distances they have to drive. We heard people say, well, I'm only going to be driving a short distance. So yes, I'm impaired, but I can probably make it work. Or it's a familiar route. I do this all the time. I know where I'm going. I probably shouldn't, but I feel comfortable driving home now anyway. And they did tell us that they would try to avoid highways. That was one of their mechanisms of justifying to themselves that this was an acceptable behavior. Oftentimes, they would tell us that this decision to drive while impaired is related to their car and not wanting to leave it behind. They would talk about needing it at home. They don't want to have to go back for it later. That's just too inconvenient. It's also time consuming and expensive if they have to use a ride share to go back and get it. They might be concerned about leaving their car wherever it was parked. If it's in a bad neighborhood, they're concerned about break-ins. Also, we heard a lot about the price of overnight parking, especially in urban and suburban locations. To leave their car overnight, take a ride share home, go back for it the next day was just simply so expensive that it was easier, or not easier, but they could justify to themselves drinking and then driving home. We heard that ride shares are often ruled out as a viable alternative because of their expense or perceived um, lack of safety, or they would tell us that there's no good public transportation option. Ride shares can feel expensive, especially in urban areas. In particular, they talked about the surge pricing late at night. As a result, they would prefer to, make the decision to drive just because of the cost. We heard as well that late at night, some, especially single women, feel unsafe in a ride share. They know they're impaired. They're not comfortable being with a stranger in their car. This same lack of safety can apply as well to concerns around taking public transportation home. And then in suburban and small town environments, it may be that just public transportation is not an option. All of this contributes to their reporting to us that they would make the decision to drive home. We heard them talk about taking steps to avoid law enforcement, especially in the suburbs and smaller markets where law enforcement is said to have a heavier presence. They think they know where law enforcement sets up checkpoints, and so if they are driving home, they'll make an effort to avoid those places. Drivers believing themselves impaired will take alternative routes to avoid them, side streets versus main roads, and certainly avoiding highways. So sadly, there is an evasive behavior here. They recognize perhaps that they shouldn't be doing this. They're going to do it anyway, and they're going to take steps to do it in a way that they feel will avoid law enforcement. There was even a suggestion among our Chicago urban respondents that law enforcement isn't enforcing or deterring driving after drinking. There's a sense that impaired driving is not a priority for them. The police are more concerned about guns, more serious crimes. And that belief leaves some with the feeling that they are open to impaired driving because the likelihood of being stopped is lower. This is unfortunate, but a mindset we heard about. So in the interest of time, as I kind of begin to bring us to a close, I want to leave you with just sort of this capture of the justifications, the catalysts, the reasons we heard why some people do continue to drive even when they know they're impaired and likely shouldn't. They don't believe they're drunk. They got away with it before. They're driving a familiar route. It's expensive to leave their car. They know how to avoid law enforcement. They think they're going to sober up when they start driving. They don't think that this time is as bad as other times. They know they can avoid the highway. Rideshare is too expensive. Law enforcement doesn't really care about drunk drivers as much as other issues. DUIs, crashes aren't going to happen to them. They don't want to be told what to do. They need their car. They feel unsafe in a rideshare. They don't have enough firsthand negative experiences to serve as a cautionary tale. They feel invincible. They're not going very far. They're worried about their car being broken into, or they just don't feel like they have a viable public transportation option to get home. All of this collectively is adding to contributing to these behaviors that Maureen gave us the statistics around. We did, though, hear, hopefully, some opportunities to help prevent some of this behavior. So going back to this idea of the plan, those that have a plan tend to not end up in these situations as much. So anything that can be done to help them create a plan, a more structured and thought through approach to how they're going to manage their drinking and then also get themselves home, helping them think through how to get there, how to get home, what are safe transportation options, and what to eat and how to hydrate to help offset some of the drinking. Throughout the course of the evenings, giving them reminders to help them stick to the plan, gentle nudges to help them assess their impairment, recognize the signs they've had too much, reminders throughout the course of the evening to eat and hydrate, and reminders of that plan for safely getting home to help prevent the decisions, the justifications that they make to themselves that lead to this behavior and these openness to driving. And lastly, what we heard is that there's openness to messaging around the cost of ride shares being high, but much less than a DUI ultimately can be. Also, an openness to messaging around the harm that their decision to drive could bring to others, helping them confront the potential loss or lasting impact on the lives of people that they leave behind or that they impact. And also really helping them think about the impact that their decision to drive could have on their own loved ones. Because it seems as if in the moment when they're making this decision, it's often a very selfish decision. And these are things that could be done to help them broaden their thinking and begin to overcome that range of catalyst justifications that are leading to this really troubling behavior. So, on that note, Maureen, Aaron, back to you, and perhaps any questions that we've received along the way.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We do have a question. This question is from Mark, and I'll have you answer it for us, please, Maureen. The question is, you mentioned that people wonder how strong the drinks will be, but how will they know? Do you think that better information and clearer labeling of alcoholic drinks is important? What do you think about informing customers about how many standard drinks they are consuming with each order? And then Mark gives an example about how sometimes a margarita is more than one standard drink, 1.75 standard drinks, and also the example of a pint of beer, particularly an IPA, could be two drinks given in one glass. Maureen?
Sure. As we said at the beginning, responsibility.org really is committed to empowering adults to make responsible choices. And we have a number of programs, specifically the virtual bar, which allows a user to put in their very specific information, their age, their gender, their weight, and go to a virtual bar and understand what's in the drink. It'll tell you how much alcohol you're consuming, what the ABV is, as well as letting you see how that drink will affect you, how you'll be feeling, as well as indicate what your BAC is to help you make informed decisions. We also think that if you're out at a bar or a restaurant, you should be asking questions. Your bartenders love to engage with you, so you should ask them what's in your drink, how much is, what's the pour in that, so that you have a better understanding. And the more that you can empower yourself, and the more that responsibility.org through its programs and information can help empower individuals when they're making those decisions to and choosing to drink, to do so responsibly, we think are a lot of opportunities that present themselves to empower you to make responsible choices. Dan talked about a plan. The virtual bar is a perfect example for making a plan. It lets you see before you're going out what you can consume, what your BAC will be, what kind of drinks you might prefer to drink, so that you have a really solid understanding before you venture out.
And Maureen, if I may just add to that quickly, because it's interesting, I shared you through like the checklist of these are all the things people consider, but no one considers all of those things. And I think that the virtual bar is encouraging consideration of things that maybe some people aren't thoughtful about or don't recognize have an impact. So yes, I showed you 12 things people think about, but not everyone is thinking about all of those things. And a benefit of what responsibility is doing is to help highlight the things people don't know to think about.
Great. Thank you. We do have another question. I'll send this one over to you, Dan. The question is, was sobering up while driving more common in rural and urban or in a certain age group?
I would like to say yes, but no. What we heard was sobering up or lack of sobering up, I suppose, common across the three different geographic communities that we spoke to. I do think that there's more attempt at sobering up among the older, quote unquote, more mature drinkers, those who have a better sense of kind of their own experiences. I think among the 20 somethings, there was a greater degree of, for lack of a better term, carefreeness. And so therefore not making as much of an effort to sober up, or also a greater sense of invincibility and therefore not feeling the need to do that. And I almost want to use that as a segue into another one of the questions that has come in, which is, did participants talk about their friends trying to help them find another way home? And it does sound as if there is some bit of looking out for each other, but ultimately these decisions are ones they're making on their own. It's a sense of, I don't want to be told what to do. I know my own limit. I need my car tomorrow. And so therefore they're almost, if their friends are trying to help them make better decisions, they're maybe not listening to their friends as much as they should. And I would say that that kind of hard-headedness, again, had a greater overlap amongst the younger folks that we spoke to than the older.
Great. We are getting quite a few questions in here, so I'm going to keep them coming. This question, I'm not sure if you'll be able to give us the answer, Dan. It comes from Candace. How many had been arrested for DUI before you questioned them? And did their prior arrest change their behavior?
Yeah. So I would say we conducted 9 research sessions. It was 3 in each of the cities. And in every session, I think we had, let me take that back. I would say in each of the 3 cities, we heard from at least 2 or 3 people who had described a personal experience with a DUI, either themselves, perhaps less in the recent past. I think it was more of the like 30 somethings, 40 somethings talking about something that had happened to them in their 20s. But we also heard about them describing people, knowing people who had received them. Yes, I think that having had that personal experience or knowing people who had does help mitigate or mute some of the factors that we've described here. But nevertheless, they were also talking about this same behavior, that they as much as they'd been through the DUI and had sort of learned a lesson, they were still perhaps engaging in these behaviors. I think that they go in with more of a plan. They go in with more of a sense of their impairment. And yet, I think they are ultimately as susceptible to these catalysts as those that had not been through the DUI experience. I think that was disheartening for us because one would hope that people had really taken to heart their experiences, but that didn't seem to always be the case.
The other thing I will add, having observed all the groups, is that those who had a prior DUI or an experience with it tended to be a little bit more knowledgeable about understanding some of the very same things we're talking about, like understanding what's in your drink, knowing
ABV.
what ABV is, knowing what your BAC is or what the legal limit is, and different things like that, because they had gone through some sort of treatment's not the right word, but educational program as a result of their experience with the DUI and law enforcement.
I do have a question from Mark. This is a different Mark. Do you find that people who choose rideshare drink more excessively?
I think from this research, yes, and yet that wasn't so much the focus because we were really listening for the people who choose to take their car and then ultimately bring their car home. Um, I believe that those who are focused on rideshare are going to be, that's part of their plan and part of what enables them to feel like they can drink more. I think some of them might find themselves in the private vehicle of a friend driving home. But we were really focused here on understanding the people who ultimately decide to drive themselves home in their own cars and why they're making that really poor decision.
Thank you. This is another question from John, again about rideshare. It says, and of course we all agree with this, in a world of Uber and Lyft, I can't believe anyone still drinks and drives. So when evaluating the cost of the ride versus a human life. So absolutely, I know you touched on that already, Dan. Were there any
Yeah.
price points that were given like as the deterrent? Or what did people bring up the fact that you can request female drivers using Lyft to help with that safety concern?
That's a really good point because in the conversations I remember having, so people leave the focus group and we all huddle and Maureen and Aaron were both there live with me. They were sitting behind the focus group glass, and we'd say to ourselves, why are people doing this given that there are ride shares? And there is an awareness, of course, on your all side, on the responsibility side of the ability to request a female driver. And yet, to sort of go through some of the things that were in the question, there is a sense that like surge pricing is expensive. I think maybe some people threw out like 75, $80, but they weren't saying But if it had been 25, I would have done it. I don't think we got that granular. There is just a sense that like it's expensive to get home during surge pricing. It's maybe unsafe. And then there's the added cost of I got to get another ride share to get me back to my car. I'm worried about my car, and maybe my car is in an expensive parking lot. And that collectively leads them to rule out rideshare, despite its seeming convenience and seeming um, minor value compared to the value of a human life.
Absolutely. And this question comes from Katie. Katie says, lots of research over the past few years has talked about how Gen Z is drinking less. However, a recent report said that younger generations are still drinking in certain categories. Did you see either of these trends in your conversations with the younger generation you spoke with? For example, more drug use and less alcohol, less tolerance with binge drinking and things like that.
Yeah. It's a great question. So just a reminder, we went out specifically to find people who are engaged in this behavior. So in that respect, I believe that yes, many Gen Z are drinking less. We specifically went out to find Gen Z who are still drinking because they were relevant to these conversations. We did hear about recreational drug use commonly among the 20 somethings, somewhat commonly among the older. So I believe that Gen Z are more involved in that use. They seem to be aware of their limits. They also seem to be reticent to mix alcohol and recreational drugs. Um, and many of them described real binge drinking, and that especially, in like the rural market, we were in Fresno, we heard a lot about there's not much else to do, we all just go to the parking lot and drink together. So I believe, to Katie's point in the question, yes, all of those Gen Z trends are true. This research being about understanding catalysts of what leads people to drive while impaired had us really focused on that behavior, sort of separate from those other trends that we see happening.
Great. And I know that you did touch on this a little bit, Dan, particularly with females being a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps getting into a ride share. But can you share a little bit more? A question from Faith. Did anyone share concerns regarding safety when using rideshare in general while under the influence?
Yes. And there is that thought of I am in a stranger's car and I have had too much to drink. I think it is much more pronounced among women than men. Um, but there is that sense that somehow in their impaired mental math, it is safer to drive themselves home than to be impaired in a stranger's car. It's hard to fathom, but it's what we heard. Darren, it looks like.
I was just going to say too, and there's a question that was in here as well, but you're starting to see some of these ride sharing apps that have added extra security. You can track your ride with somebody else. There's some other things there, but does that help change the comfort level and the feeling of safety for individuals? And so I think that's another piece of this. One thing that we've also seen in some communities is allowing for, if somebody does feel like they've had too much to drink, that they can leave their car overnight without it being impounded, because sometimes they have like, no overnight parking and some of the things that people feel like, well, I can't leave my car there. So you're starting to see some of those provisions so that they could come back and get their car. I had a conversation with an Uber driver just a while back, and we asked him about, do you see a lot of people that have been drinking using rideshare? And he said, yes. He says, in fact, what I find is I'm taking people in the morning back to their cars so they can go to the office. And so, you're starting to see some of that dynamic, but it's not everywhere. Rural communities are I think one of the challenges is where we don't have lots of rideshare or public transportation. So I think there's that messaging piece that we need to continue about making plans, don't drink and drive, and that kind of thing. So, but just to answer some of those issues around Uber, or at least the rideshare.
Great. And I know that across the country too, there are all different kinds of varieties of rideshare. We hear about Waymo, the autonomous vehicles. So, so many options for people to get home safely. Maureen, I'm going to pass the floor back over to you as we get to time. Wait, actually, let me check. Oh, well, let me go into, I guess, one more question. I think we have time for one more. But we did have a question about using designated drivers. And so Candace is asking, was there a discussion about using a designated driver and how did people respond to that,
Mhm.
Dan?
Yeah, so I think that that did come up in the conversations around sort of making a plan or sort of thinking about the evening they're going to have and are they going to have a designated driver. Um, I think that it does help get many people home safely, and it is something many people are doing. Um, this was qualitative research. It was focus groups. I don't have percentages to give you. I believe that behaviors we heard about are hopefully more edge case, that ride shares and designated drivers and public transportation are helping people avoid doing the things we talked about. And yet when they do them, these are the reasons they do them. So I don't want to say that like, oh no, designated drivers, that doesn't work. In fact, that's something people talked about. What we talked about here and covered here today are when the plan breaks down. And so part of that plan is ride shares, is designated drivers.
Absolutely. And I do like what you said about not only having a plan, but somehow setting a reminder or having someone with you who can remind you to stick to the plan. All right, and now we are getting close to time. So, oh wait, I'm so sorry. One more from Nicholas. Did anyone you spoke with use a breathalyzer-like device to keep track of their intoxication throughout the night?
Um, that's sorry, I'm pausing because I remember a bullet from the deeper report that Maureen has access to about this, and I just need a second to think about this. We did hear that 2 or 3 people had them across the entire 9 focus groups, which is about 30 something plus people. We heard one person talk about them as being sort of a funny toy they play with at home. We heard no one say they take it with them or use it throughout the course of the evening. I believe the people who had them overlapped with those who had DUIs. But net, it was a very minor part of this entire conversation or set of learnings. They don't seem to be actively commonly used.
And I maybe just a reaction to this comment that just came in from Deanna. Rideshare and public transportation are not available in rural areas.
Yes. And or the rideshare is that much more expensive. So I mean, it's not that we didn't hear about Uber and Lyft in Fresno, but we didn't hear about them as much as we did in Chicago and Denver. Public transportation clearly there, especially out of like during these late night drinking hours, much less available. And a reminder as well, late night drinking hours when the bars are closing is when the surge pricing is hitting. So it's in the rural areas already not common and now that much more expensive.
Great. All right, so now it is official. I'm going to start wrapping up. I do see a couple questions in here. I will make sure that we get them addressed. We can find your emails in the transcript. So thank you all again. I'm going to pass the floor back over to Maureen.
First of all, I want to thank you, Dan, for a great job presenting the research. Dan is available to answer questions. Aaron said there's a few more questions, so we will get you responses to those. Darren is also available after this session if you have questions about DUI systems in general. If you have questions about our educational programs, I'm available, but any one of us are happy to assist you. If you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again, Dan and Darren, for joining us today. I appreciate it. And thank you, Aaron, for being the hostess with the mostess.
That is always my pleasure. And thank you all to all of you who attended the webinar and joined in on this conversation. I love a lively Q&A box, and today was absolutely that. I do just want to close with the fact that we all share the roads. We all have responsibilities. Conversations like this last a lifetime. They do help change our thinking and inform our thoughts. And this new information will allow us to engage in more of these meaningful conversations for sure. Like I said earlier, we will follow up this webinar with the recording. Hope that you share it, that you maybe reflect upon it. And we'll also share some topics and highlights over social media over the next couple days. Once again, thank you for all that all of you do to help make good choices and keep our roads safe. Like Maureen mentioned before, these are people, they're not just numbers. And working together, we will all get there responsibly. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.